Thanks for being with us this afternoon as we continue our series of discussions called Conversations for an Equitable South, where we're digging deep into how individuals play a role in creating, sustaining, and ultimately changing racist attitudes and actions. Today, we'll have part 3 of our conversations focused on the role white women have to play in upholding or dismantling structural racism in our communities. Motherhood is a topic that has come up in both of our previous conversations. Our society has strong beliefs and narratives about what it means to be a good mother or a good parent. But what is the role white mothers and white parents play in shaping the beliefs and behaviors of their children when it comes to race? And in a broader sense, how do mothers and our narratives about motherhood shape our politics on issues of race and equity? Our panel of experts today will explore those themes and more today as they share their own stories with motherhood and the work they've done to understand white mothers and parents. We have a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. I'm so happy to welcome our panelists. Nefertiti Austin is the author and memoirist who writes about the erasure of diverse voices in motherhood in the critically acclaimed Motherhood So White, a memoir of race, gender, and parenting in America. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Huffington Post, and many other publications. She is the proud adoptive mother of 2 children and lives in Los Angeles, California. And Maggie Hagerman is an associate professor of sociology at Mississippi State University. Dr. Hagerman is the author of the award-winning book, White Kids Growing Up with Privilege in a Racially Divided America. And she is a nationally recognized expert on white racial socialization processes. Her research explores how children and youth learn about racism, racial inequality, and racial privilege in their everyday lives. Our conversation today will be moderated by Dr. Megan Underhill, an assistant professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. She is a race, family, and inequality scholar who studies how white parents understand and discuss issues of racial and class inequality with their children. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Now, Megan, I'll toss it over to you.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Mitch, and for organizing this conversation. And Maggie and Nefertiti, I'm really looking forward to speaking with you today about parenthood and race. So I wanted to start by asking you a broad question about how you came to the place of studying parenthood. Maggie, good, Nefertiti.
Want to go first? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right, thanks for having me. So excited to be here. So I, like many young women, looked forward to getting married. I had visions of, a gown and 15 bridesmaids, et cetera, and all of that kind of went away as I got a little older in my 20s and realized I wasn't ready for that level of responsibility. And fast forward about 10 years later, when I was really ready to become a mom, and I began thinking about what made sense for me and for my lifestyle and for my sort of family upbringing, which really informed my thoughts on motherhood. And because I was raised by grandparents, ultimately it made sense that I would adopt because I call it my Black adoption. I was reared in a household by people who we were related, but they hadn't given birth to me. And so I, set off on my chosen path, which was adoption. And I quickly began to see that my story wasn't there. I didn't see narratives. I didn't see myself in parenting books, that sort of thing. And so I really found myself very early on questioning, what's happening in motherhood that Black mothers are not there, that there's this huge lack of diversity within the parenting genre. And that's really what kind of got me started on what's going on and, what can I do to fix this, especially since I made the point of wanting to adopt. And I knew Black people who had adopted, but there seemed that I was the only one in the world. And I knew that that definitely was not the case. So I felt the weight of the erasure of my experience within motherhood, within parenting. And that was really the impetus for me to begin writing about motherhood.
Thank you. What about you, Maggie?
Yeah, so first of all, it's really great to be here and be in conversation with both of you this afternoon. So when I was in graduate school, I became really interested in this topic of racial socialization, or how it is that children learn about race, particularly in the context of their families. And as I began to read all of the scholarly literature, I found so many really important studies about the ways that families raising Black children are preparing their kids for living in a racist society. And so, lots of articles about how to help kids navigate racism, and so on. But what I began to wonder was like, well, if, Black families or parents raising Black children are teaching their kids how to navigate racism, what's going on in white families? Like, what are white parents teaching their kids? And so I wanted to study that, and I was just really curious about it. And so I did what's called an ethnography, where I spent 2 years with 30 white families. These were also families that had class privilege, so they were both racially privileged and had class privilege. And so I just observed the families, I talked to the kids, talked to the parents, and over the course of those 2 years, I was able to try to at least begin answering this question of what's going on in white families and how are white children learning ideas about living in a racialized society, navigating privilege, how are kids learning about white identity, and so on. So that's what brings me to this conversation, is really more from a research perspective. I guess I'm just, it's just been really great to be able to spend so much time with different families and see the range of different things going on.
Excellent, thank you. So I want to talk to you in more depth about both of your projects, but I want to ask you, Nefertiti, a more detailed question about how did you discover that society holds these stereotypes about Black mothers? And can you remember sort of the first instance in which it really became quite apparent to you that Black women's experience, Black mothers' experience was erased?
I really love to read, and I love information, and so I like to, I want to know, what was this person's experience like, and how did they navigate choosing sort of an alternative path to parenting? Like in the white community, adoption is definitely very normalized. Not so much in the Black community, because for us it's more of an internal structural family configuration, because we look internally first. We look to support nieces and nephews and grandkids, that sort of thing. And so when I looked for information and I couldn't find any, that was the biggest tell. It's like, okay, if I can't find any information, and certainly in our country, if it's not on the page, it doesn't exist. And when I began writing about motherhood and querying agents and getting, oh, wow, you're a great writer, this is such an important topic, but it's too marginal. You won't get it published because your experience is too marginal. So I'm being told that my experience as a mother, as a Black mother in, United States, in the midst of all of the other moms, my experience is marginal, it's not important, it's not real to a certain degree. And so it really felt then and now that motherhood is very white. Most of the advice, the point of view for motherhood is a white lens, and then everybody else. And so obviously there's diversity within white motherhood, but just a basic sort of casual Google search and finding articles about Black motherhood, I came up short, just too many times. And then when I reflected on, okay, pop culture, what's happening, what are the television shows looking like? Because so much of our information we get from media. And, what are the movies? Who's being celebrated as mom, whether she's a bad mom, a shitty mom, lazy mom, whatever the case may be, it's never us. We might be the sidekick mom, or we might be the welfare mom, but there's nothing that positively supports us unless it's sort of a one-off type situation. And so it wasn't really hard to feel marginalized, and it wasn't hard to notice that, wow, there really isn't anything, or our experiences are really, they're anecdotal in the larger story of parenting when they really shouldn't be, just given the role of Black mothers and white mothers in this country.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And so I'm curious, what's been the reception to your work? You were told that this was a marginal perspective. How has the public received your work?
It's been really exciting. I've gotten a lot of wonderful notes from women. So Black women have said to me, thank you so much I see myself on the page. Many Black women have said, gosh, I thought about adoption. I wasn't sure I could do it. You know, I didn't know how to go about it. I didn't know how to talk to my family about it. Thank you for giving me language. And even from men, it's been pretty cool, because often, you know, it's a book on moms and, you know, men, that's not for me. But many men have found it to be something that's accessible. And as a single parent, it's super important to build community for your children. And that's something that I made a point to talk about in Motherhood So White. And I definitely got a lot of positive feedback, like, oh, so this is how you build a community to support your children when it doesn't look like, you know, the traditional family model.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And that brings me to a question that I have for you, Maggie, which is one of the things that I really appreciate about your wonderful ethnography, White Kids, is that you very clearly make the point that, yes, it's important what parents say to their kids, but actions fundamentally speak louder than words. And that how the things that white parents do for their white kids has a more significant impact on how white children think about race and racism when they grow up. So I was hoping that you could speak to us a little bit more about that finding.
Yeah, so, you know, it's very interesting to me. You know, there's so many articles and resource guides and websites and all kinds of things about how white parents should talk to their white kids about racism. And there's been, you know, there's all kinds of examples that we can find if you look. But what there is not as much of is a critical, I think, interrogation of what white parents are doing to set up their child's life that then leads their kids to understanding the world in a particular way. So, for example, the neighborhoods they choose to live in, the schools they send their kids to, the kinds of friendships that they encourage or discourage with their kids, the kinds of media they consume, talking about media, you know, the kinds of books that they're reading, the kinds of vacations they're taking, and how their parents are talking to them when the children are noticing patterns in the world around them. You know, those kinds of things I think are not talked about as much. And what I found from my research is that those are the things that really matter in terms of the actual kids. So, you know, one of my frustrations also is that we focus so much on, we think about racial learning, we focus a lot on parents or teachers or institutions like schools, and we don't always listen to kids and actually try to figure out, like, well, what are they learning, like, and why? Like, why are they coming up with these ideas? What kinds of questions do they have that are going unanswered? And so, just as a quick example, you know, I talk in the book about taking a child through a drive-through in a predominantly Black neighborhood, and we're at McDonald's or whatever, and he's in the back seat, and he notices that the kids outside the window are Black, and he makes a comment to me like, "Oh, we're not in a very good neighborhood, are we?" And it's just like this moment where you can really see how, you know, he's noticing a pattern around him, and he's already internalized this idea that we have, you know, stereotype or racist stereotype about Black children in Black neighborhoods and Black spaces. And so, you know, I think that, you know, no one ever said directly to him, you know, this neighborhood is dangerous, but he's interpreting that from a host of different things in his social environment, or his racial context of childhood is what I call it, that would lead him to that conclusion. And so I think that, you know, it's really important for white parents to be thoughtful about the messages they're sending to their kids, potentially that are not even verbal, right? That are connected more to their behaviors. And so one of the things I talk about in the book is that for many of the parents that I interviewed, they really struggled with you know, how to set up their child's life in a way that mapped onto their stated ideals about being anti-racist. So they would say things to me like, I'm anti-racist, I want to raise an anti-racist kid, but, you know, I want to send my kid to this elite, you know, predominantly white, private, expensive school, and I want them to have, you know, I want them to go to this exclusive summer camp, and, you know, and they had all this whole list of things. And so, you know, a lot of times I found that the parents' decisions about how to set up their kids' life just didn't match on to what they were saying they really valued. And so I talk about that as a conundrum of privilege, because remember, the parents in my study all have you know, economic resources as well. And so they can make lots of different decisions about how to set their kids' life up. So, Yeah, so I can say a lot more about that, but I think that kind of gets at my broader point about how actions do speak louder than words, and we can't ignore the actions of parents and what they're actually doing to set up their kids' life, and then how their children are interpreting those decisions.
That's a good point. And Nefertiti, that reminds me of your work, because you also speak about actions and the actions that white parents can take. And one of the things that you mentioned in your writing is that you would like white parents and white mothers to teach their white kids to take care of Black and brown kids. And so I was hoping that you could speak to us a little bit about what that would look like, right? What does that mean about white kids taking care of Black and brown kids? And have you seen models of this that you could share with us that are successful?
Yeah, definitely. One of my favorite examples I go to is if my child walks home with your child, maybe they're going to have a play date after school or they're hanging out, what have you. And if your child who is white typically takes a shortcut through the neighbor's yard, it's not a big deal, it does it all the time. But the day that my child is with you, you tell your child no shortcuts through the yard, because the neighbor doesn't know this child. And we know that the child who will get in trouble will be the Black child. We know that the child, if a sheriff is driving down the street and it's a predominantly white neighborhood and you guys are goofing off, any other time it's okay. But when your Black friends are with you, that's not the day to goof off. That's not the day to have a water fight in front of the house, because though the gun might be bright orange, and though it may be a toy, in Black hands is often mistaken as a deadly weapon. And then that just perpetuates more violence against Black bodies. And for younger kids, or even middle school kids, but for the younger kids, I have a friend whose daughter who noticed that two of her friends were playing. I'm not sure what the girls were doing, but the teacher took one tone with the white girl and she took a harsher tone with the Black girl. Mm-hmm. And the little girl tells her mom, and her mom spoke to the teacher about it. And so, I don't expect a child to confront an adult. It certainly never suggests that, but, you empower your children. And one of the ways you can empower them is saying, hey, if something happened at school and they're telling you about it, then maybe as the white parent, you could reach out to the Black parent and say, what happened today? I heard such and such happen. I didn't hear anything from the teacher. Or the white parent can reach out to the teacher directly and say, wow, Jimmy and James were playing, they had an issue, Jimmy's mom got an email, I didn't get one, but the boys were together. So what happened? So that way, the teacher who, it's implicit bias, not necessarily even realizing that that's what, he or she did, will be called out and have a moment to reflect upon, well, why did I mete out different punishment? Why did I maybe overly criminalize, the Black child, and say for the white child, oh, they're just being a boy, oh, they're just being rambunctious, and it's just okay. So I think that there are many ways that parents can talk to their children, and it has to be intentional, and it has to be direct. My children go to private school and definitely early on bumped into the issue of unequal punishment and unequal, getting too many emails and phone calls from school, and then really having the support of, white friends and the administration to be able to really examine what is that about, why are people bringing this to the table with children. And I think another thing that we can teach kids to do is really kind of check in on each other. So before this meeting started, we talked about COVID, and I was saying I'm so excited that last year my kids were able to go outside and play, and we've been a bunch of kids on the street, and gentrification, of course, is alive and well, and we've got white neighbors and wonderful family. And I say to my son after George Floyd's murder, did you guys talk about it? Mm-hmm. And he said no. And he had feelings, and he was feeling his mortality and sad for what happened. And I thought, wow, these kids play together every single day, but the white kids didn't know just to ask, hey, are you okay? That would have gone a long way just to sort of help my son feel like we are safe. It's more than just my mom saying it. It's my white friends, my allies who are supporting me, these co-conspirators, at 12 and 13. So there's certainly lots of ways we can help each other.
That's a great point. And I think it really speaks to also a conversation that the public is having more broadly about what does allyship look like and how can you show up as being an ally, and certainly responding to things that your kid says when they come home from school about unequal treatment, and then following up on that is an example of that. So I want to talk to you a little bit more about the things that parents can do, right? The kinds of messages, verbal and nonverbal, that parents can convey. And I think this is becoming, it's always been important, right? But in light of the fact that critical race theory has become such this hot button topic, right? Where states and legislators around the country are now beginning to say that race and racism shouldn't be conversations that people have at school. And, you know, this is concerning. It's concerning for a lot of reasons. One, among white parents, because a lot of white parents are hoping that their kids are going to learn about race and racism at school. So if these conversations aren't being had at school, it puts more responsibility on the parents themselves. So if you're thinking about these parents, right, in the world that we live in today, how would you suggest that parents provide their kids with a full and complete understanding of race and racism in the United States? Where can they start? What are some things that they should be doing?
Is that for me?
Let's go with you, Nefertiti.
Okay. Okay. The pushback against critical race theory is confusing. And it's confusing because race and racism has been embedded in the fabric of public education since it began. And it's embedded in the fabric of our society and housing and car purchases and healthcare and on and on and on. And to suggest that adding Zora Neale Hurston, you know, to the canon, or to talk about Black scientists or artists or opera singers or what have you, dumbs down the curriculum is offensive, and that is racist in and of itself. And it's like there's room for everyone, and it's interesting sort of to watch. I imagine this is similar to when busing started in the early 70s. I know, Maggie, you said you grew up in Boston. So I know there was issues, even in LA, I was a product of busing, and, you know, whenever there's change, it's hard and it's uncomfortable. And I think that we have to be willing to sit in the discomfort so we can get to the other side. And this histrionics, as though it's just going to ruin people, and it speaks to your child is better than mine. Your child's emotional health and soul is better than mine, because it's okay for the kids to continue to read Huckleberry Finn, and it, you know, or it's okay for the kids to read about the Holocaust, but we can't talk about the African Holocaust. Like, that makes absolutely no sense to me. As far as, like, you know, what parents can do, there's not nearly enough literature or programming to that's available, but there's enough. I think that as a writer and as a Black writer, lots of questions about what can we do, and that emotional labor is put on us. And so often, I know I've said, well, I've used Google just like everyone else. I go to the internet when I have a question about something, or I call a friend, or, you know, I do my homework, I do my research. So I think white parents need to do their work. They've got to step up. They've got to do their work. And it is as easy as a Google search, speaking with a librarian. You know, the world is opening up again, talking to teachers, seeking out forums on the internet that speak to self-esteem and image and health and race, and start there. And if, you know, Black people don't have all the answers either. We're trying to figure it out as well. So, but be willing to ask a question about something, but do your homework first. Don't go to your Black friends and say, okay, tell me the history of the world, and you fix it, you know, so.
Absolutely. What do you think, Maggie? As somebody who studies white parents, what kinds of things would you advise?
So I completely agree. I saw there was a really excellent essay in The Nation published last week by Ellie Mistal called The Miseducation of White Children. And I think that's one place to start, for example. There are many. But the author is really talking about how critical race, this attack against critical race theory, which I agree is very confusing. I don't know what K through 12 schools are actually teaching critical race theory in the way that it is actually written, if you've actually looked at or studied critical race theory. But that aside, I think that the author is making this really great point about how this is an attempt to keep white kids dumb, is the quote that he uses, or ignorant about the details of the history of racism. And it's interesting because one of the things I always recommend to parents is that they need to learn the history of racism if they want to talk to their children about it. I think that there are so many ways that families can do this together. There's lots of resources that are available, but I think that regardless of whether we're in the midst of this, attack on critical race theory, which I think it's really important to note that this is a political strategy of misinformation. This is not a legitimate critique of a, theoretical paradigm. That's not what's happening here. I think it's really important that we keep our eye on that and are really clear about that. And I think that, so I guess my point is that regardless of whether we're in this particular moment or not, I think it's really important to learn this stuff so that you can talk to your own kids about it. I think that it's important to listen to kids' questions and try to figure out where they are with all of it. I think it's important to connect with other parents. So there's lots of organizations, there's a great group that I love called Embrace Race, that has all kinds of webinars and other things available for parents, across different racial groups as well. Integrated Schools is one that I really like, Showing Up for Racial Justice, We Stories. There's a number of different organizations that I think are useful. So I think finally, my last point is just that, understanding that not giving your child this information is keeping them ignorant, and this is not going to help them, and it's not going to help our society more broadly. And quite frankly, I just don't know how we will live in a multiracial democracy if young people don't understand the past so that they can make sense of the present.
That's a good point. And I wanted to ask you, Maggie, you've been studying this since about 2010. And you've studied it in different areas of this country, this question. Have you seen that there's been change over time in the way that parents are going about communicating messages to their kids about race and racism? Or is there regional variation in terms of the messages that white parents are communicating to their white kids?
Well, I really appreciate you asking this question. I do think you are probably really the perfect person to answer it based on your awesome research. In terms of my stuff that I've been doing more recently, it's interesting, right? Because there's been a lot more conversation, especially since last year when George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were murdered, that, there's more discussion, I think, amongst white parents about these conversations, but I don't see very much evidence that actions have really shifted all that much. And so while there's more perhaps reading of books and going to book clubs and all of this, which is fine, I just don't know how that's translating into action and how that's ultimately getting communicated to kids. So it is true, when I did my research for this book, for my book, White Kids, it was the second term of President Obama. And so that was a very different moment, I think, politically than some of the research I've done more recently. And so in my more recent research, I'm trying to look at the connection between politics and political socialization and then racial socialization, and basically asking the question of, like, well, if kids were taught their entire lives that we live in a colorblind society where racism is over, and then we have a president who is expressing explicitly racist sentiments constantly, how are they making sense of that? Like, how are these kids, what do they think and what do they feel and how are they responding? And so to answer the question, I do think that there has been some shifts that are happening with children, and I'm trying to explore that and how kids are navigating that. In terms of different regions of the country, I can't make any big generalizations about that given the small sample size that I'm working with for my studies. But I do think that, there are some interesting racial differences in racial attitudes, differences in what kids know about. Like, kids in Massachusetts didn't know anything about Confederate monuments or Confederate flags or anything like that. And interestingly, when I collected this data, kids in the South didn't know anything about Black Lives Matter. I think that's probably changed since when I collected the data for this second project. It's really hard to like keep up with things that are happening as you're doing research. But I think that the point is that racism, I think, really is broadly an American project, and there are some regional variations. But I have found kids in both Mississippi and in Massachusetts who are across different racial groups, across different class groups, who are expressing different ideas about race. And so, yeah, that's my next project that I'm trying to get into a book. But again, I just want to say your research, Megan, is so awesome and really speaks to this as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. Nefertiti, I wanted to, you've written about things that you think that white women should know about Black mothers. What are some of the things that you think are important for white mothers and white women to know about Black mothers, especially white mothers who have young children, and these children are, just beginning to form friendships with folks? What would you like them to know?
Oh, I think a few things. One is that Black women have fertility issues just like white women do. I think there's still very much a prevailing myth that Black women can just get pregnant and it just happens. And, more and more conversation about that is coming out. It's something people talk about, but like on a larger scale, I think that we have fears around our kids' safety, our kids' emotional and physical safety, and that's real for us. Like it's not something that we can just kind of shake off. And we culturally we tend to parent differently because Black parents parent from a space of fear, and we want to be free to let our kids, go running wild and doing crazy stuff and be able to say, oh, that's age appropriate behavior. But unfortunately, we have been taught either directly or indirectly that there are things that white kids can do that Black kids can't do. And so, and it's hard to have those conversations, especially in privileged spaces when you're dealing with white people who have money and who are accustomed to being able to let their kids kind of just be free. It's a different experience for us. And I think that the other thing is just, we want our experiences to be as normalized as white mothers' experiences. And when you get up close and you forge friendships with Black mothers, we have so much in common. And I have a lot of white mom friends, and we certainly talk about race, from time to time, but we have like regular conversations. So don't expect a conversation with a Black mother to always be so heavy and so sad, and so somber. We talk about, I'm doing a 30-day plant-based challenge, and it's killing me because I want some wine. And I'm like, gosh, it's only June 9th. How many more days? And, we sit around and we talk about vacation or books that we've read, or, we're just regular women out in the world wanting the best for our children, the best for our relationships, and, having health issues or mental health challenges just like any other mother. So I think really there sometimes seems to be this for white women, at least from my perspective, like if I can't come in so deep or so knowledgeable about what's happening racially in the world, she's not going to talk to me or she won't be my friend. And that's not true.
That's interesting. So have you found that this has, there's been an increase in this type of interaction with white moms and you, that more of them are coming to you, looking at you as a type of racial expert or wanting to engage with you in conversations about race since the Floyd protests?
Yeah, it's funny. Not so much my friends, but I've done a bunch of Zooms, like I'm sure you guys have, and been on a lot of panels, and then for some of the writing. And I have joined a panel, where I'm part of this parent expert squad, which is so funny to me because as a Black parent, I don't know that we think of ourselves as parenting experts. And, just in terms of I have a master's degree, but we are not necessarily, even those who are psychologists or psychiatrists and who work with children, I don't think parenting expert is something that we have necessarily attached ourselves to. But the moment that attached itself to me, well, then suddenly many doors opened. And there were lots of white women who were reaching out from all over the country saying, oh, you're a parenting expert, and, you know, we would love to talk to you. So in that respect, definitely, you know, lots of invitations and people wanting to listen, asking for advice. And, you know, I'm one person, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Black community. We are not a monolith. I'm just my experience and my observations, just, you know, just being a citizen of the world, just out and about.
Yeah. Maggie, do you think that a lot of white mothers or white parents in general know about some of the things that Nefertiti's just named here? Do you think they're aware of these things?
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, again, I can't make generalizations. I can only speak to the data that I have from the white women and men that I've interviewed for my research. I'm not convinced necessarily, based on at least what I have observed and what I've heard. I do think that, you know, it's been interesting over the last year to sort of see people expressing different interests and sort of approaching, I think, the topic of parenting and thinking about how parenting includes teaching your kids about race, whether you think you're doing it or not. I think there is more awareness of that on the behalf of white parents, at least the ones that I've spoken with. But it's, yeah, I don't have any really good data to kind of go off of, but that's sort of anecdotally what I would say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to say, from the folks that I've interviewed in the city where I live in Asheville, North Carolina, there have been a lot of parents that I've spoken to, not by any means the majority, but many of the parents have acknowledged some of the things that you're saying, Nefertiti. Certainly not because they've had the lived experience, but they've gone and done a lot of racial equity trainings. They've been reading a lot of books, following BIPOC scholars and activists on social media. So one thing, though, that's come up in the past EPU conversation was about motherhood being political, right? That in the past conversation, there was a focus on and a discussion about how white women have helped to maintain and create this white supremacist system that we're all embedded in today. And so during those conversations, several of the panelists, again, talked about the role that white mothers are playing in sustaining this structure of white supremacy. Do you think that motherhood is political when it comes to race? And if so, how do you find that to be true? Nefertiti, how about we'll start with you?
Okay. Yeah, I think so. I mean, when you take a look at the women's movements, you know, the first one and the second ones, the first wave and the second wave, and the moment race is introduced into the conversation, then it's, oh, no, we're talking about gender. And so, as you know, my intersectional experience, you know, it crisscrosses all over the place, but at my core, I am a Black woman, and there's nothing I can do to change that. And so my intersectional experience as a mom, as a cisgender, middle-class Black mom, is going to be very different from someone else's. But as far as race goes, my life is worth less than, you know, another white woman's life. I mean, we see that with, you know, Breonna Taylor and Sandra Bland and so on and so forth. And so when the conversation and when we're talking about like politics and uplifting each other and universal child care and support for moms, you know, while they're pregnant, you know, before, after adoption, that sort of things, still much of the emphasis is still on seemingly, let's make white women comfortable. You're like, you know, how can we still maintain the status quo and making them feel good? So these articles, I mean, I've written them as well, giving, you know, pointers. Okay, step one, do this step, you know, were it that easy, we wouldn't be having this conversation. And so I think that white women need to get really comfortable with the fact that our lived experience includes racism and how mass incarceration has impacted our families, and homelessness, and, you know, and HIV, and now we can add COVID-19 to our lived experiences and how it has directly, detrimentally impacted our communities, regardless of where we are socially and economically. And so, yes, I do think that it's something that needs to be addressed. And I think that white women, obviously not everyone, but those who feel threatened by introducing race into the conversation need not, because it helps everyone at the end of the day. We're all a better people. We all get to move the needle forward. And the pandemic, this was the women's depression, all of the women who got kicked out of the workplace and who are looking for ways to re-enter the workplace. I mean, that wasn't a Black thing or a Latinx thing. That was a woman thing. And that's for all of us to get together and strategize and find a way to dismantle white privilege, white supremacy, a system that was, ultimately designed to support white men. And we all have something that we can get if we can work together and get past the fact that it's more than just a gender issue. It's race and gender and sexuality and so on and so forth. So.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. What do you think, Maggie?
Yeah, I completely agree. And excuse me, I definitely think that motherhood is inherently political. I mean, maybe it's because I'm a sociologist, but often we think about family life as this like private, personal space. And while that is of course true, sociologists have long demonstrated the ways that family life intersects and interacts with all kinds of institutions outside the family, like daycare and paid work and legal system and the child welfare system and our economic policies, like Nefertiti was just mentioning. Even things like healthcare and immigration. And so, I think it's really important that we think sociologically about this question around the politics of parenting, because depending upon where a particular family or group of families are situated within these larger political and economic conditions, and in racial conditions, that's going to have different consequences for their lived experiences, for the ways they navigate the world, for the kinds of decisions they make about raising their kids. And so like for the parents in my study, because of where they're positioned in terms of race and class, they are, I argue, reproducing racial inequality through their parenting, because they're setting their kids up to get this idea that they're better than everybody else. I mean, the kids are literally tell me that. They look around and they say, oh, well, kids like me go to this school because we're the smart kids, kids like me are going to be leaders. Kids like me don't get in trouble because we're better, so kids are learning all of these things as a result of this social environment that the parents have set up. And that social environment is set up based upon where these families are positioned within these intersecting hierarchies. And so, I definitely think that not only is motherhood inherently political, but I think the parenting decisions that people make, whether they're mothers or fathers, are ultimately political, especially because we know like the intergenerational transfer of wealth. I mean, that is about families literally reproducing, and we know that's a racial gap. That's a racialized pattern in our society. And so, white wealth continues to get reproduced from generation to generation because of the role that the family is playing. I sort of take that a step further and say, though, that it's not just the material conditions of inequality that these families are reproducing, but also the ideological ones, right? The kids are learning all of these narratives and frameworks that they're using to justify the racial status quo rather than challenge it. And this is where we see the real need, I think, for learning history and learning about the racial wealth gap and understanding where that comes from, just as one example. So I definitely think that parenting is inherently political.
Mm. What I liked about the two comments, both of what you just said, is that Nefertiti, you're really speaking about how people are hurt by these things that Maggie's talking about, which they're doing thoughtlessly. Maybe not from, a point of any ill will, but just unconsciously reproducing these things that hurt your family and other Black and brown kids. Is there anything to be hopeful about, though, today as it relates to today's youth? We've had a lot more public discussion about race and racism in the last year since George Floyd's murder and the protests that followed. Is there something that you can talk about or that you can pinpoint that makes you feel hopeful about youth for today?
Well, I definitely feel hopeful. One of the things that's been great about the pandemic, because it was really, really hard and really terrible for a lot of people, but there were a lot of silver linings. And certainly, you hate for someone to die because a police officer has their knee on them, or just die, period. But I think so much that has come out of the last year is really this Band-Aid that has been ripped off, and people were really forced to kind of take a look at, the ugly America, the reality, the real America, and to really talk about it. And that's been a good thing, I think. And despite people pushing back on preserving their white children's innocence, there's been a lot of schools that have said, oh, we're going to incorporate stories, AAPI, Latinx, whatever the case may be. I was talking with my son yesterday about Juneteenth, which is coming up next week. And he was teasing his cousin. He's like, oh, you never heard of Juneteenth before. And I stopped him and I said, you are growing up at a different time. When I was a kid, I didn't know about Juneteenth until I got to college. And so how fortunate you are to know about this at 14, and your sister gets to learn about it at 8, and that there are children all over the world who will get to learn about, the probably second to the last vestiges of the end of American slavery. So I think because we've had a racial reckoning, I mean, we're still, in the midst of it, of course, but it's been wonderful to see the information that is out in the world, that has been disseminated, and that people are talking. And so sometimes it's, even if it's just to get the conversation, even if it's a hard conversation, people are talking about it. And I think that's a great thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What do you think, Maggie?
Yeah. It's an interesting question. I have to be honest. On the one hand, I don't feel very hopeful, just based on my research findings, which I hate to say, but I think it's important to be honest about that. Because I think that what I find over and over again is that, many of these white privileged parents, they think that they're being a good parent by giving their children all of these unearned advantages and not being critical. And like Nefertiti mentioned, white innocence, when white parents insist that those things are more important than caring about everybody's kids and understanding that all children are important and are worthy of consideration, and that kids should learn to take care of each other. I loved that point from earlier. I think that until parents are moving in that direction, I don't feel particularly hopeful, because I think that parents are using their forms of privilege to pass it on to their own kids. And I guess I just find it difficult to see that how that will change unless parents are willing to really embrace this idea that, being a good citizen is potentially better than, or is another goal, than just being a quote unquote good parent. I think we can actually complicate what it means to be a good parent. I think being a good parent can mean caring about your kid and also caring about other kids too. So I just want to add that. But on the other hand, if I'm trying to be optimistic and more positive, I will say that, I've met so many really amazing kids. So kind of moving away from the parents, I've met so many amazing kids who are doing really important work, challenging their parents, challenging their schools, challenging the policies that are, speaking of the racialized discipline patterns in their schools. I have met some kids that are joining together, kids across different racial groups, and trying to create change in their own communities. And I'm really inspired by youth-led organizations and by the great work that young people are doing. And as I've gone around, it's funny. I'll give a talk about this book, and the Q&A will be dominated by the parents, and then at the very end, after it's all over, a couple kids will come up to me and kind of take me aside, and we'll have this like really powerful dialogue. And they don't feel like they can say what they want to say around all the parents. So anyway, I guess my point is that maybe it sounds kind of cheesy, but I do think that looking to the kids is really where I feel more hopeful than their parents.
Mm. So we have one last question, and this is the question from an EPU audience member. And this question is asking you to think a little bit about your mother, right? Thinking about your mother. What kind of racial justice message has your mom provided you with, either as a kid or as an adult? Nefertiti.
So that's a complicated question for me. So I was not raised by my mother after the age of 9, and we didn't have a close relationship. But what I can say is that when she was a young woman, she and my father were both part of the Black Power movement. And so early on, I mean, at 3 and 4 years old, I certainly heard things about the pigs, and I was very clear on, they were talking about the police. And, but knowing that, there was a time in her life, and she got off on drugs. And so, her life took a turn, but that racial equality was very important to her. And so I think that even my thesis on looking at the intersectional experience of Black women in the Black Panther Party and this romance novel I wrote about Black power and love. And I believe that that's probably ultimately the lesson that I got from my mother would be about love of people. And same with my dad. So in my own way, I see, especially as I continue to write, that my parents would have been Black Lives Matter all day long. They would have been in the front row, you would have seen them on the news, going to jail the whole night. That is not who I am, but I will write. And that is how I raise my fist, is my Black fist for equality is through my words. And so that is something I believe that I got really from both of my parents, probably my dad more, but definitely something that I bring to my parenting and certainly my writing.
Maggie, we don't have a lot of time left, but is there a lesson that you could share with us about your mom?
I mean, I think the most important lesson that she and my father taught me is that it's important to stand up for what is right, even when it's not very popular, and even when it's hard, and even when people around you are challenging you and wanting you to kind of stick to the rules, that if you believe something is unjust, that you have a responsibility to do something about it. I think that lesson just broadly, even when it's not popular, I think that's the message that my mom gave me. Yeah.
Well, thank you both. Thanks for being here and having this discussion with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You guys, thank you, Nefertiti, Maggie, and Megan. Thank you so much for this incredible conversation. I want to just give a shout out to my mother, who had 9 children in 11 years, and she now has 38 grandchildren. And she has been a great inspiration in my life. And Megan, as you were talking, you were reminding me, my mother always taught me, just be fair and be honest. And some of the things you guys said today was just so incredible. I really appreciate your insights and your knowledge. It's unfortunately true that Black lives are not worth as much as white lives in America today. And really all we're trying to do is level the playing field and create an environment where we lift everybody up, because unless we're all lifted up, we all can't get there. I'd encourage anyone watching today to pick up all of the books that you guys have written to learn more, because they're so insightful and they're so prescient in so many ways. So thank you again for your work. And again, thank you to everyone for joining us today for this important discussion. We look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great day.